January 12th, 1945. In the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler received the first reports of a massive Soviet offensive along the Vistula River. The official Wehrmacht communiqué would speak of heavy defensive fighting and flexible responses to enemy pressure. But in the privacy of the military situation conference that evening, the words were different. They were the beginning of a 6-month descent into a peculiar madness, where the gap between what German High Command said publicly and what they admitted privately would grow until reality itself seemed to split in two. Hitler's first reaction, recorded by stenographers still dutifully transcribing every word, was not alarm, but irritation. "This is Gehlen's doing," he said, referring to his chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front. "These exaggerated reports, they want to make me nervous." General Oberst Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, stood across the map table with a folder of intelligence summaries. The Soviets had massed over 2 million men, 7,000 tanks, and 41,000 artillery pieces along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Carpathians. Guderian had been warning about this for weeks. "My Führer," Guderian said, his voice tight, "the reports are accurate. We have confirmation from multiple sources. The offensive has already penetrated our forward positions in several sectors." Hitler's hand swept across the map, dismissing entire army groups with a gesture. "Then they will be thrown back. Counterattacks will restore the line." "With what forces?" Guderian asked. The question hung in the air. It was a question that would be asked, in various forms, thousands of times over the coming months. With what forces? With what fuel? With what ammunition? With what hope? The stenographic record shows Hitler didn't answer directly. Instead, he began talking about new weapons, about jet aircraft that would sweep the skies clear, about divisions that existed only on paper being moved on the map as if they were real. Guderian would later describe this conference as the moment he realized the war was truly lost, not because of Soviet strength, but because the man commanding German forces had lost the ability to see what was real. By January 15th, the Soviet offensive had torn a hole nearly 200 kilometers wide in the German lines. Army Group A, defending Poland, was disintegrating. Refugees clogged the roads westward, mixed with retreating soldiers. The Soviets were advancing up to 40 kilometers per day. At the situation conference that evening, General Oberst Heinz Guderian brought updated maps showing the scale of the breakthrough. Hitler studied the maps in silence. Then he said something that several witnesses would remember with particular clarity. "The Eastern Front has never been stable. It expands and contracts. This is a contraction. We will stabilize it." General Lieutenant Walter Wenck, who was present, would later testify that he exchanged glances with other officers. The Eastern Front was not contracting. It was collapsing. There is a difference between a planned withdrawal and a rout, between a tactical adjustment and the dissolution of entire armies. Everyone in the room knew this except, apparently, the Supreme Commander. But the words that came from Hitler's headquarters to the armies in the field were different from the words spoken in the conferences. The orders were explicit, detailed, and completely disconnected from reality. Army Group A was to hold its positions. Army Group Center was to prepare a counter-offensive. Fortified cities designated as Festungen, fortresses, were to be held to the last man. No retreat without explicit permission from the Führer himself. General Friedrich Hossbach, commanding 4th Army in East Prussia, received one such order on January 16th. His army was in danger of encirclement, with Soviet forces driving toward the Baltic coast to cut it off. He requested permission to withdraw. The response from OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, was signed by General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff. The Führer orders 4th Army to hold present positions and prepare for counter-offensive operations. Withdrawal is forbidden. Hossbach read the order, then made a decision that would end his career. He ordered the withdrawal anyway, without permission, saving most of his army from encirclement. When Hitler learned of this, he relieved Hossbach of command immediately. The message was clear. Reality was less important than obedience. In his diary entry for January 17th, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who attended many of these conferences, wrote something revealing. The Führer is entirely calm about the situation in the East. He believes we can stabilize the front once we commit our reserves. I wish I shared his confidence. The reports from the front are catastrophic. Entire divisions are simply ceasing to exist. This gap between Hitler's calm and everyone else's catastrophe would define the next months. At the conference on January 20th, with Soviet forces now within 200 kilometers of Berlin, Guderian again pressed for realistic defensive measures. We must evacuate Army Group North from the Courland pocket, he argued. Those divisions are needed desperately on the main front. Hitler's response was recorded by multiple witnesses. Army Group North stays where it is. They tie down Russian forces. That is their purpose. They tie down our forces, Guderian shot back. 26 divisions that could be defending the Reich are trapped in Courland, serving no purpose. The argument escalated. Witnesses described Hitler's face reddening, his voice rising. I will decide what serves a purpose. I will decide strategy. You will execute orders. Guderian, normally composed, lost his temper. Someone must tell you the truth. The Eastern Front is collapsing. We are losing this war. The room went silent. No one spoke to Hitler this way. Generaloberst Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW, stepped between them. Gentlemen, please. The conference ended shortly after. Guderian left the bunker convinced he would be arrested. Instead, Hitler simply began excluding him from certain meetings, preferring advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. By the end of January, the Soviets had advanced 500 kilometers in some sectors. Warsaw had fallen. The industrial region of Silesia was under threat. Army Group Center was cut off in East Prussia. At the January 27th conference, Hitler's assessment was brief. The Russian offensive has culminated. They have outrun their supplies. Now is the time for our counteroffensive. There was no counteroffensive. There were no reserves to launch one with. The divisions Hitler moved on the map existed only in his imagination, or existed as shattered remnants of their former strength. A division that appeared on the map as 15,000 men might be 3,000 exhausted soldiers with no heavy weapons. But the orders kept coming, each one more disconnected from reality than the last. On February 1st, General Oberst Ferdinand Schörner, commanding Army Group Center, received orders to attack northward and restore contact with Army Group North. Schörner, a committed Nazi and one of Hitler's favorites, sent back a situation report. His army group had no fuel for a sustained offensive, no air support, and was already engaged in desperate defensive fighting on 3 sides. The response from Hitler's headquarters was terse. The Führer has ordered the attack. It will proceed as planned. Schörner, in a radio message to his corps commanders that was intercepted and preserved, said something that captured the surreal quality of the situation. We are ordered to attack with forces that do not exist, using fuel we do not have, to achieve objectives that are militarily meaningless. Execute these orders to the best of your ability. The attack failed before it began. Most units never even reached their jump-off positions. In early February, Hitler made a decision that revealed how his mind was working. He appointed Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, to command Army Group Vistula, a newly formed command meant to defend the approaches to Berlin. Himmler had no military training, no command experience, no qualification for the position except absolute loyalty to Hitler. Guderian was appalled. At the February 5th conference, he objected directly. Himmler is not qualified for this command. We need an experienced army officer. Hitler's response was cold. I need someone I can trust, someone who will not retreat without orders, someone who understands the necessity of fanatical resistance. You need someone who understands tactics and operations, Guderian said. I need obedience, Hitler replied. Himmler took command and promptly demonstrated his incompetence. His headquarters was poorly organized, his orders contradictory, his understanding of the military situation almost non-existent. Within days, officers on his staff were quietly going around him, trying to coordinate the defense despite their commander rather than through him. On February 13th, Dresden was destroyed by Allied bombing. At the conference the next day, Hitler barely mentioned the Eastern Front. Instead, he spoke at length about retaliation against Britain, about new wonder weapons, about the Allied coalition falling apart. When Guderian tried to bring the discussion back to the immediate crisis, Hitler cut him off. The situation in the East is under control. Himmler will stabilize the front. I want to discuss the West. But the situation in the East was not under control. By mid-February, Soviet forces had established bridgeheads across the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. The defenses were improvised, undermanned, and facing an enemy with overwhelming superiority in every category. The orders from Hitler's headquarters took on an increasingly fantastical quality. Cities were to be held as fortresses. Counterattacks were to be launched by divisions that had ceased to exist. Retreat was forbidden, even when it meant certain encirclement and destruction. And through it all, the official communiqués spoke of successful defensive operations and inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. On March 1st, Guderian brought Hitler a report on German tank strength in the East. The numbers were devastating. Fewer than 1,000 operational tanks facing over 8,000 Soviet tanks. Guderian argued for concentrating all available armor for one decisive defensive battle. Hitler's response was to launch into a 40-minute monologue about the superiority of German equipment, the fighting spirit of German soldiers, and the incompetence of Soviet commanders. When he finished, he had not addressed Guderian's proposal at all. Instead, he ordered the available tanks dispersed along the front in small groups, ensuring they would be defeated in detail. Guderian left that conference and told his aide, "We are being led by a madman." By mid-March, the situation had deteriorated further. The Soviets were preparing their final offensive toward Berlin. Guderian continued to press for realistic defensive measures, for permission to evacuate untenable positions, for the concentration of forces where they could actually make a difference. On March 28th, Hitler relieved Guderian of his position. The official reason was health concerns. The actual reason was that Guderian kept telling Hitler truths he didn't want to hear. He was replaced by General Hans Krebs, an officer chosen primarily for his compliance. Goebbels wrote in his diary on March 30th, "The Führer has made changes in the military leadership." Guderian was too pessimistic, always seeing problems rather than opportunities. Krebs understands that will and determination can overcome material disadvantages. But will and determination cannot overcome the absence of ammunition. They cannot conjure fuel from empty tanks or soldiers from empty barracks. The Soviet offensive was coming, and everyone except Hitler seemed to understand that nothing could stop it. On April 1st, Hitler issued a proclamation to the soldiers of the Eastern Front. It was read aloud at the daily conference, and several officers present would later describe the scene. Hitler stood as an aide read his words. "Soldiers of the German Eastern Front, our enemies are preparing their final assault. They believe they can destroy the Reich. But they do not know the strength of German resistance, the power of German weapons, the determination of German soldiers. Every position will be held. Every attack will be thrown back. Berlin will never fall." When the reading finished, there was silence. Then Generaloberst Jodl spoke carefully. "My Führer, the troops will be inspired by your confidence, but they also need concrete support. Ammunition, fuel, reinforcements." "They will have what they need," Hitler said. "Everything is being prepared." It wasn't. The reserves didn't exist. The ammunition was running out. The fuel was gone. But the orders kept coming, each one demanding the impossible, each one threatening dire consequences for failure. On April 16th, the Soviet final offensive began. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 41,000 artillery pieces attacked along the Oder and Neisse rivers. The German defenders, numbering perhaps 750,000 men with fewer than 500 operational tanks, fought with desperate courage and were overwhelmed by sheer mass. At the Situation Conference on April 16th, Hitler received the first reports. His response, recorded by multiple witnesses, was eerily calm. "This is the enemy's last gasp. They are throwing everything into this offensive. When it fails, they will have nothing left. Then we counterattack." Krebs, the new chief of staff, tried to explain the scale of the Soviet attack. Hitler interrupted him. "I know the scale. I also know our soldiers. They will hold." By April 18th, the defenses were crumbling. Soviet forces had broken through in multiple sectors and were advancing toward Berlin. At that day's conference, Hitler's assessment was brief. "The situation is serious, but not critical. Reinforcements are on the way." What reinforcements? Officers looked at each other. There were no reinforcements. Every available unit was already committed or destroyed. But Hitler was specific. "Steiner's army will attack from the north. Wenck's army will attack from the southwest. They will cut off the Russian spearheads and restore the front." Steiner's army was a scratch force of perhaps 15,000 men, many of them Luftwaffe ground crew with minimal infantry training. Wenck's 12th Army was engaged against the Americans to the west and had no fuel to disengage and drive to Berlin even if ordered. The orders went out anyway. Steiner was to attack immediately. Wenck was to disengage and march to Berlin. The encirclement would be broken. The front would be restored. On April 22nd, Hitler held a conference that would become infamous. He had been waiting for reports of Steiner's attack. None came. Finally, he demanded to know why Steiner had not attacked. The answer was simple. Steiner had no force capable of attacking. His scratch units were barely holding their positions against Soviet probing attacks. An offensive was impossible. When Hitler was told this, witnesses described a breakdown. He began shouting, accusing everyone of betrayal, of cowardice, of lying to him. The war was lost, he said, because he had been surrounded by traitors. The German people had failed him. The army had failed him. Everyone had failed him. Then, just as suddenly, he became calm. He said he would stay in Berlin. He would direct the defense personally. Steiner would attack. Wenck would arrive. The situation would be restored. Generaloberst Jodl tried to interject reality. "My Führer, Steiner cannot attack. Wenck cannot reach Berlin in time. We must consider evacuating the government." Hitler's response was flat. "I'm staying in Berlin. Anyone who wishes to leave may do so. I will remain and direct the final victory." There would be no final victory. By April 25th, Soviet forces had encircled Berlin. The city was cut off. Inside the pocket, perhaps 300,000 German soldiers and Volkssturm militia faced over 2 million Soviet troops. The orders from Hitler's bunker took on a hallucinatory quality. Wenck's 12th Army was to break through from the southwest. Buss's 9th Army was to break out of its encirclement southeast of Berlin and link up with Wenck. Together, they would relieve Berlin. It was all laid out on the map with precise arrows and timelines. But Wenck's army was being destroyed piecemeal by Soviet blocking forces. Buss's army was already disintegrating, its soldiers surrendering or fleeing westward. The arrows on Hitler's map bore no relationship to what was actually happening on the ground. On April the 26th, Generaloberst Krebs briefed Hitler on the actual situation. Soviet forces were fighting in the suburbs of Berlin. The defenders were running out of ammunition. Many units had been reduced to small groups of soldiers fighting from cellars and rubble. Hitler listened, then asked, "When will Wenck arrive?" "My Führer," Krebs said carefully. "Wenck is not coming. His army is being destroyed. He cannot reach Berlin." Hitler stared at the map. After a long silence, he said, "Then we will hold with the forces we have. Every street will be contested. Every building will be a fortress. Berlin will be defended to the last man." On April 28th, Hitler received a report that Heinrich Himmler had attempted to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. His reaction was one of the last recorded outbursts. Treachery. Even Himmler, the most loyal of the loyal. He ordered Himmler arrested, an order that could not be executed because Himmler was beyond his reach. By April 30th, Soviet forces were within blocks of the Führerbunker. The situation conferences had dwindled to a handful of officers in a concrete room, moving phantom armies on a map while the real battle raged above them. That afternoon, Hitler dictated his final political testament. In it, he blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. The generals had betrayed him. The people had not been strong enough. International Jewry had poisoned the world against Germany. To the end, he took no responsibility, admitted no errors, learned nothing. His final military order, issued that same day, was for the defense of Berlin to continue. Every position was to be held, no surrender, no retreat. Fight to the last bullet. Hours later, he committed suicide. But the orders kept coming even after Hitler's death. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, named as Hitler's successor, issued a statement to the armed forces on May 1st. "The Führer has fallen. Fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism, his struggle continues. We will fight on." For what? To what end? The question was never answered because the answer was there was no end, no purpose, no strategy. Just the momentum of obedience, the habit of following orders, even orders that made no sense. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. General Helmuth Weidling, the city's last defender, made the decision Hitler had forbidden. He surrendered to save the lives of his remaining soldiers and the civilians trapped in the ruins. The official Wehrmacht communiqué that day spoke of the heroic defense of the Reich capital and inflicting severe losses on the enemy. It did not mention the surrender. It did not mention that the war was over. It simply stopped mid-sentence, as if reality had finally broken through the wall of words. On May 7th, General Oberst Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims. The next day, General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel signed a second surrender document in Berlin for the Soviets. In the years after, many of these officers would write memoirs, give interviews, testify at trials. They would explain how they had known the war was lost, how they had tried to tell Hitler, how they had been ignored or dismissed or threatened. They would describe the atmosphere in the bunker as surreal, disconnected, insane. But the stenographic records, the orders, the communiqués tell a different story. They tell of men who kept executing impossible orders, who kept moving phantom divisions on maps, who kept speaking of victory even as their armies disintegrated. They tell of a high command that had lost the ability to distinguish between what they said and what was real, between the orders they gave and the results they achieved. In his interrogation by Soviet officers in May 1945, General Oberst Krebs was asked why the German High Command had continued fighting when defeat was obvious. His answer was recorded in the Soviet files. "We were soldiers. We followed orders. The Führer ordered us to fight, so we fought." "But you knew it was hopeless." "Yes. Then why?" Krebs had no answer. Or rather, his silence was the answer. They had followed orders because that's what they did. They had spoken of victory because that's what was required. They had moved divisions on maps because Hitler demanded it. And when reality finally could not be denied any longer, when Soviet soldiers were in the bunker above them and Berlin was in ruins around them, They had simply stopped, like machines whose power had been cut. The gap between what German high command said and what they knew had grown so wide that by the end, they inhabited two completely separate worlds. In one world, armies maneuvered and counterattacked and held firm. In the other world, those armies had ceased to exist. The soldiers were dead or captured or fleeing, and the war was over. The tragedy was not that they lost. The tragedy was that they kept pretending they hadn't, kept giving orders to ghosts, kept describing victories that existed only in their words. They spoke of holding positions that had already fallen, of divisions that had already been destroyed, of counterattacks that would never come. And in the end, when the stenographers stopped recording and the radios went silent and the maps were rolled up, what remained was the gap between their words and reality. That gap was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives, in cities reduced to rubble, in a nation destroyed. They had said they would never surrender. They had said Berlin would never fall. They had said the Eastern Front would hold. They had said victory was certain. They had been wrong about everything, but they had never stopped saying it, right up until the moment there was no one left to say it